The year is 1695. The mood in Edinburgh is not one of hope, but of starvation. The harvest has failed for the third year in a row. The streets are gray, the mood is grim, and the cold cuts through the stone walls of the city. Yet, inside a warm, candlelit room, a man is selling a dream so bright, it blinds a nation to the precipice standing right at its feet. This is not merely a business deal. This is a rescue mission for a drowning country. Now, let us open the archives and dissect the anatomy of this failure. To understand the Darien Scheme, you first have to understand the desperation that fueled it. Scotland in the late 17th century was economically suffocating. They were locked in a forced marriage of geography, with England a powerful neighbor that treated them like a poor relation, blocking their trade and choking their economy with heavy tariffs. Scotland was like a small shopkeeper trying to survive next to a Walmart that was actively cutting their power lines. They needed an escape route. They needed their own empire. Enter William Paterson. Paterson was a man of dangerous charisma. He was a financial architect, the mind behind the Bank of England, a man who understood that money wasn't just metal coins. It was belief. He came to the Scottish nobility not with a weapon, but with a map. He pointed to a slender strip of land in Central America, the Isthmus of Darien, known today as Panama. Paterson's pitch was elegant and intoxicating. He called it the door of the seas and the key of the universe. The mechanism he proposed was simple: a three-part engine fueled by the physics of global trade. First, the shortcut. Instead of sailing the deadly route around the tip of South America, ships would simply dock in Darien. Second, the transfer. Goods would be hauled overland across that slender strip of land to the waiting Pacific Ocean. And finally, the monopoly. Whoever held this gate would take a toll on every crate of spice, silk, and gold that passed through. It was the concept of the Suez Canal, 2 centuries before the technology existed to dig it. The plan required capital, massive capital. Initially, Paterson looked to London and Amsterdam, where the deep pockets lived. But the English crown, jealous of the competition and protecting its own monopoly, the East India Company sabotaged the fundraising. They threatened legal action against any Englishman who invested. This should have been the warning shot. It should have been the moment the lights went on and everyone went home. Instead, it triggered a fatal psychological reflex: national pride. If England wouldn't let them play, Scotland would build its own table. The Company of Scotland opened its subscription books in Edinburgh. This was the 17th century equivalent of an initial public offering, IPO, but with a manic, patriotic twist. It wasn't just an investment, it was a crusade. The target was £400,000 sterling. To the modern ear, that sounds like pocket change. But in 1698, £400,000 was a leviathan. It represented roughly a quarter to a half of all the circulating money in Scotland. Imagine if the United States today took half of every dollar in existence, every bank account, every retirement fund, every bill in every wallet, and bet it all on a single startup company in the jungle. The result was a frenzy. The subscription book became a sacred text. Dukes and duchesses signed their names next to merchants, who signed next to shopkeepers. People liquidated their assets. They sold land, they pawned jewelry, They emptied the rainy day jars hidden in their kitchens. They weren't just buying shares. They were buying a ticket out of poverty. They were buying dignity. Paterson promised them 100% returns, 200% returns. He spun a narrative of a lush paradise where gold could be picked off the ground, and the soil was so fertile you didn't need to farm it. On the 14th of July, 1698, 5 ships, the St. Andrew, the Caledonia, the Unicorn, the Dolphin, and the Endeavour set sail from the port of Leith. The decks were packed with 1,200 settlers. The docks were lined with thousands of cheering Scots, weeping with joy. They watched their entire national economy float out into the North Sea, carried on a wind of pure delusion. They thought they were sailing to the Garden of Eden. They didn't know they had just packed the country's wealth into a wooden hearse. On the 2nd of November 1698, the fleet dropped anchor in a natural harbor they named Caledonia. From the deck, it looked like the prospectus promised. Lush green canopies, golden sands, and a strategic position that commanded the horizon. They planted the Scottish flag and began to build New Edinburgh. But geography is a cruel accountant. As soon as the boots hit the sand, the asset turned into a liability. The location Paterson had chosen was not a paradise. It was a mangrove swamp. It was a biological petri dish. The water was brackish, the soil was difficult to clear, and the air hummed with millions of mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever, the invisible tax collectors of the tropics. But the first disaster wasn't the fever. It was the business model. If you are a forensic historian looking for the smoking gun of this failure, you don't look at the map. You look at the ship's manifest. This is where the tragedy shifts from sad to absurd. The Company of Scotland had failed to perform even the most basic market research. They had packed the ships with goods to trade with the indigenous tribes in the Spanish colonies, expecting to swap their cargo for gold bullion. So, what did they bring to the sweating, humid jungles of Panama? They brought heavy woolens. They brought thousands of linen stockings. They brought 1,500 copies of the Bible. And, in a move of staggering incompetence, they brought 4,000 powdered wigs. Imagine the scene. A Scottish merchant, sweating through his clothes, standing on a beach, trying to sell a heavy, itchy, woolen periwig to a Kuna chief who is standing comfortably naked in the heat. It was a liquidity crisis of the highest order. The Scots had assets the warehouse was full, but they had 0 customers. They couldn't convert their inventory into cash, or more importantly, into food. They were sitting on a pile of worthless stock, while their stomachs began to growl. Then, the regulatory risk kicked in. King William III, sitting comfortably in London, decided that the Darien colony was a threat to his relationship with Spain. He didn't just withdraw support. He signed the colony's death warrant. He issued a decree to the English governors in Jamaica, New York, and New England. No trade, no assistance, no communication. It was a total economic embargo. The Scots were starving, and the English colonies, their neighbors, their cousins, were legally forbidden from selling them a single barrel of flour or a cup of fresh water. The supply chain was severed. The Scots were now trapped in a hostile environment with no revenue, no resupply, and no exit strategy. Then came the flux. In the history of finance, we talk about toxic assets. In Darien, the toxicity was literal. Dysentery and fever swept through the camp like a fire in a library. It didn't pick and choose. It took the sailors, it took the soldiers, and it took the women. The mortality rate skyrocketed. The ledger of souls went deep into the red. Men who had invested their life savings to come here found themselves digging graves in the soft mud, only to fall into them a week later. At the height of the crisis, 12 men were dying every day. William Paterson, the architect of this dream, watched his wife die in the mud. Then he watched his friends die. He fell into a delirium, a broken man hallucinating in a tent, while the key of the universe rotted around him. By the summer of 1699, the survivors couldn't take it. They abandoned New Edinburgh. The ships, leaking and worm-eaten, limped toward New York. They were so short-handed that the healthy had to prop up the sick just to hoist the sails. But the tragedy wasn't over. This is the part of the story that hurts the most: the information lag. Back in Scotland, the news of the disaster hadn't arrived yet. The Atlantic Ocean was a buffer of silence. In Edinburgh, rumors were flying that the colony was a massive success. They had found gold mines. The stock price was surging on the secondary market. The hype machine was redlining. Based on this false data, Scotland sent a second expedition. More ships, more money, more men. They sailed out with high hopes, chasing the ghost of the First Fleet. When they arrived in Darien, expecting a bustling city of commerce, they found only silence. They found the ruins of the fort reclaimed by the jungle. They found the graves. And then they found the Spanish. Spain had finally decided to foreclose on the property. They sent a fleet to besiege the pathetic remnants of the second expedition. The Scots, weak, starving, and disillusioned, held out for a month before surrendering. The Spanish commander, seeing the walking skeletons that marched out of the fort, was so moved by pity that he allowed them to leave with their dignity, if not their lives. The door of the seas slammed shut. The survivors drifted home, carrying nothing but the news that would break a nation. The capital was gone. The inventory was gone. The men were gone. The gamble had failed. And now, the bookie was coming to collect. The news hit Edinburgh not with a bang, but with the silence of a stopped heart. When the magnitude of the loss finally crystallized, the reaction was visceral. The capital city descended into chaos. Mobs roamed the streets, smashing windows, searching for someone to blame. But you cannot hang a hurricane, and you cannot imprison bad luck. The reality was much colder. Scotland was insolvent. The numbers were catastrophic. 2,000 lives had been erased. The £400,000 capital, that massive slice of the nation's wealth, had simply evaporated. There were no assets to sell, no lands to claim. The balance sheet was zero. In modern terms, this was a systemic banking collapse. The liquidity crisis paralyzed trade. Landowners couldn't collect rents. Merchants couldn't pay suppliers. The economy began to necrotize. Scotland was a failed state walking. And like any bankrupt entity, it was vulnerable to a takeover. England, watching from the south, saw the opportunity. They didn't see a tragedy. they saw leverage. For years, England had wanted to secure its northern border to ensure Scotland didn't ally with France. Now, they held all the cards. They came to the negotiating table not as neighbors, but as liquidators. The offer they put on the table was the Act of Union. To the history books, this was the merging of two crowns into the Kingdom of Great Britain. To the forensic accountant, it was an acquisition deal. England offered to open its trade routes, the very thing Paterson had died trying to bypass. But the sweetener, the bribe that sealed the deal, was a specific clause known as the equivalent. England agreed to pay Scotland a lump sum of £398,085 and 10 shillings. Look at that number. It was almost exactly the amount lost in the Darien Scheme. It was a bailout. England effectively said, "We will make your investors whole. We will refill the pockets of the nobility and the merchants who lost everything in the jungle. But the price is your parliament. The price is your independence." The debate in Edinburgh was furious. The common people, who had lost sons and brothers but owned no stock, rioted against the Union. They called their leaders traitors. The poet Robert Burns would later write, "We are bought and sold for English gold, such a parcel of rogues in a nation." But the shareholders, the men who held the worthless paper of the Company of Scotland, they took the deal. They looked at their ruined ledgers, and then they looked at the English gold. The choice was between national pride and financial survival. On the 1st of May 1707, the Union took effect. The Company of Scotland was dissolved. The Darien debt was wiped clean, and Scotland ceased to exist as an independent political entity. The gamble that was meant to make Scotland a global empire had instead turned it into a province. The key of the universe didn't open a door to the world. It locked the door on a kingdom. The Darien disaster is often remembered as a story of bad luck of mosquitoes and Spaniards. But strip away the jungle rot, and you see the eternal flaw of the speculator, the belief that enthusiasm can substitute for due diligence. Scotland bet the house on a map drawn by a dreamer. They ignored the logistics, they ignored the competition, and they ignored the market. They were seduced by the fear of missing out, terrified that the wealth of the world was passing them by. It is a story that repeats in every bubble, from the tulip fields of Holland to the server farms of Silicon Valley. When a promise sounds too good to be true, it is usually because the cost has been hidden in the fine print. Scotland found that cost in the swamps of Panama. They went looking for gold, but they only found a grave for their sovereignty. Because in the ledger of history, every debt must eventually be paid.